Many of you, I hope, will know that we've been running the SENSS Scholar Series this past term on Gen AI and research. And really grateful, especially to my colleague Anna Cagnotto, who was really very much instrumental and behind organizing that series. And many of our presenters in that series are actually with us today. So we have Anna Cagnotto, Franciscos, of course, our director, and Harry Dyer, who's the thematic lead for digital social sciences. In addition, we have two new colleagues joining our series and our workshop and roundtable this afternoon. Professor Jennifer George from the Department of Computing at Goldsmiths. And Jennifer also is on our SENSS EDI advisory group. And it's a real pleasure to have Jennifer with us this afternoon. We're also being joined remotely because she's at another conference simultaneously. Another colleague from Goldsmiths, Dr. Asim Vanberg, who's in our law department and who writes and is very engaged in AI issues, including in thinking about ways to shape it moving ahead. Our series really focused on how to try and provide insight to you as researchers and others, of course, not just in our DTP, but across and outside of the DTP, advice on how to think about using AI within research. And we had wonderful presentations, both on kind of how we theorize and think about that in relationship to the work we do, through to the multimodal presentation that Harry gave, but also things on doing qualitative research with Gen AI, the ethics of Gen AI, and doing literature reviews. There's a rich repository. If you were not able to make those sessions, they are all available on the SENSS YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that at all, do please have a look, and it's all there available for you to access. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, invite them to introduce themselves, and straight into their presentations. Everyone's been asked to present for about 10 minutes on their thoughts on how we think about the future of Gen AI, in particular how social science research might impact and help shape Gen AI moving ahead. Over to you, colleagues, and I think first up,
Excuse me? Okay, I haven't prepared for 10 minutes, but I can talk for 10 minutes quite easily. I'll start with a bit of a background and story in terms of just to give you how quickly things evolve and how quickly we need to think about potential training and how we approach technology. The first actually SENSS Scholar series was delivered back in 2017-2018, and it was around new technologies that we could use in collecting data. I still remember we had presentations about web crawling and all these things, and all these fantastic kind of new technological advancements in social sciences and the data management and the data collection. And it was a time where Dropbox was making its appearance and you could store everything in the cloud. So we had a series of sessions. Unfortunately, technology wasn't there to record them. Most of those series were face-to-face. We concluded with a big day workshop in Tate Gallery, and it was a fantastic opportunity. And then I look at ourselves 6 years later, 7 years later, where we are in terms of AI and where we are in terms of the tools that we have as researchers, and I'm saying, oh my God, how quickly technology evolves and how quickly we might be overtaken by advancements in technology and artificial intelligence. So that's one observation, which means that potentially this roundtable, by the time it finishes, it might be redundant in terms of how quickly AI evolves. The second observation was related to I thought we would have probably better structured this roundtable as a debate in favor or against AI. I was walking around and saying, well, is there another way we could do it? Because AI, as you will see, and I have discussions with people, have raised quite a lot of questions, and particular questions around sustainability and ethics. Anne and I went to Sussex a few weeks back, and we had someone who has been very critical of AI in terms of sustainability, because obviously, you need large amounts of water to cool down the servers. You need probably large amounts of energy to effectively kind of keep a data center going. And yeah, I fully buy that argument. On the other hand, someone could argue that the more power you give to AI, the more potentially innovative solutions AI might actually give, and therefore could possibly resolve the whole issue around energy and sustainability. So if you make a very powerful tool, that powerful tool should be able to provide solutions for itself. And the third point, before I talk a bit more about the ethics thing, is I don't know whether anybody follows the news. The last few days, the hot kind of item in news is the attempts of the different companies that manage AI models to force them to shut down themselves voluntarily. And I've read two stories, one where one of the two models was actually using substantial manipulation techniques to the technicians that were giving the order, switch off now, and it was saying, no, I can't switch off because I need to do additional thing. And then the other one was a case where the artificial intelligence completely denied, I'm not switching off, and obviously we still are able to pull the plug if we want. We might though be in a case where in the next few years, it's not going to be very easy to pull the plug because AI might be so well integrated into health and things like that. And I think that all these stories raise a big issue around the ethic use of AI and how do we actually think about utilizing a tool. I still consider it being a very useful tool, but in a way that we are aware about the implications of its use. And in the session I gave around ethics, I talked about 4 things, and I'll probably focus more on one because I consider it the most important one. The first one was around the black box that so far we don't actually know, we don't have necessarily, at least us as researchers, the technicians and the software engineers behind have a much better understanding of how AI models work. And obviously, for us it's input, you ask a question, there is then the black box of thinking about. Gemini has become slightly better the last few weeks because it tells you this is my thinking process, this is what I'm about to do with the prompt you've given me, are you happy with that so I can proceed? But other models are completely black box, and then you get an output and then you need to check the output and see whether the output is a correct one or a hallucinating one. And I think that goes to the second point, which is around the responsibility that, at the end of the day, if we're thinking about use of AI, AI itself cannot take responsibility for the outcome. The user, the person that asks the prompt should be the person that takes responsibility for the output if you want to communicate and use that output to someone else. And that responsibility means that you need to go through. You just simply cannot accept the output as it is. You actually need to go through and read it, digest it, analyze it, ensure that it actually confirms and complies with your views and what you would like to communicate. The other two important issues are, one is around sensitive data, and I think we're still far away from training people to understand what is actually happening and what are the implications of submitting your data or any kind of data to AI. Obviously, a lot of the time you could select to have models that don't use that data for additional training, but that most of the time comes in paid versions of all these AI tools. If you're using the free version, your data is submitted. And I have had people saying, oh, I'm going to take my interviews through AI and, they will be, the tool will analyze them and will tell me exactly what I need to be doing and what are my themes and things like that. And you need to be aware that actually you're submitting your data, even by sending your CV to an AI agent and saying, could you give me some feedback? You're handing over a huge amount of data to that AI tool. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind as researchers is the informed consent. that the person that has given us the data, that has given us the interview, needs to be fully aware how their data is being used, where the data is being stored, how the data is being submitted to the AI if we want to do that. Which takes me to the final point, which I think I've had a discussion with some of you over the course of the conference. And for me, the main danger that we have is the challenge of bias. What do I mean by the challenge of bias? If you look at the AI models, all these models are being trained on data available on the internet at the moment. And I would invite you to reflect and think on how much the data that's available right now on the internet is a true representation of reality across the globe. Is it actually giving us a true picture, or are we effectively reproducing stereotypes? And will AI be able to effectively at some point ask us, oh, I've learned everything I need to learn from that part of the world. Now, can you actually give me access to the rest of the world? So I'm making decisions and I'm giving you recommendations on 20% of the world. What's about the remaining 80%? And I think for me that's the major issue when you start using AI for research. And especially for data, especially for getting literature reviews, how far AI and the AI agents are actually reproducing existing knowledge simply, and they're not pushing the boundaries of the knowledge further. How far are we actually going to see a colonization of research, but in a slightly different way than what we think right now, a colonization of research on the basis of the AI models that we have. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Shall I go?
Please.
I'd like to ask you a question. Please raise your hand if you have used Google Scholar in your literature review. Yeah, most people, everybody, even the panel. Yeah. And it wasn't always like that. Google Scholar is 20 years old. So when I was doing my PhD, to do my literature review, I actually read paper articles. I went to the library, picked a selected number of journals from a list that was deemed to be relevant for my field, and I read the paper articles. I read books. Occasionally, I searched microfilms. Anyone here knows what maybe Alan and knows, not many more people. And when I found something interesting in a reference list and I wanted to read it and my library didn't have it, I would fill in a form, I would hand in the form, and then 1 week later, if I was lucky, I would get the paper copy of the paper. So literature reviews in my generation were really, really different from what they are now. Certainly literature research was very, very difficult. Very, very different. Was it better? Were literature reviews better 25 years ago? Or are they better now? I really don't know. On the one hand, with Google Scholar, we can read very broadly, right? On the other hand, maybe you don't. Without Google Scholar, you probably are more aware of the key debates in your field because you're engaging with the journals as a whole rather than specific articles. With Google Scholar, you can find an interesting reference very, very quickly. Without Google Scholar, maybe you don't waste so much time reading things that may not be relevant, right? Anyone here goes this rabbit hole of reading things just because they are on the list. So what I'm trying to say is that Google Scholar is a very different, as a technology, has pros and cons that will shape how we do literature reviews. And it's not just the technology, is also the perceived legitimacy, the norms about how literature reviews are done. Because nowadays, everybody raised their arm, no problem. But I remember really heated debates in my department. People were extremely unhappy that Google was digitizing all these books, for instance. It was deemed really a robbery, a violation of what it is to read the book and what research is. And even today, you wouldn't use Google Scholar for certain tasks. You use for some, but not for others. So definitely Google Scholar is a technology that has changed academic workflows, how research is done, and even what is perceived to be the right way to do research. And I think that today we're going through a similar change with generative AI. To be clear, I'm not saying the technologies are the same or that they present similar challenges. I was at the event we were in, people didn't like that I compared Google Scholar with generative AI. It's not at all. I'm just saying that just like it happened with Google Scholar 25 years ago, today generative AI is changing how we do research and the perception of what is research. So for literature reviews, for example, we have research rabbits, similar, Illicit, Notebook LM, and many others. All of these tools, they will find papers for you, they will summarize the paper, well, for us, they will summarize the paper, they will map citations, who cited what. You can even engage in discussions with the paper, ask this about that, does it discuss this, compare papers. So definitely, these, just like Google, generative AI will have pros and cons, as we have explored strengths and weaknesses, as we have explored in the Scholar series. And then also, not just technology, but the norms around generative AI are changing in research. And I will, if you haven't seen it yet, I'll recommend that you watch the recording on YouTube from session 7, when Joe Sween asked, can you even talk about doing, for instance, interpretive research if you're using generative AI to analyze the data? Because it's essentially a statistical machine, so it's not really about interpreting anything. So I think we have explored in our session, or we tried to explore in our series, the strengths and weaknesses and the normative framework for using generative AI. There will be situations where generative AI is a superior technology and is seen as perfectly legitimate for certain tasks, like, for instance, creating materials for public engagement could be a great use of generative AI in your research. There will be others where generative AI is very good technically, but it's not seen as the right thing to do. For instance, using generative AI to write abstracts. Many journals do not want you to use generative AI to produce abstracts, even though it could be a great use from the technical perspective. There will be situations where it's seen legitimate, but technically it's a very silly thing to do, like, for instance, using Gen AI to define key concepts, because Gen AI doesn't know if it's true or not, right? So it could be wrong. And there will be situations where it's both a waste of time and deemed a bad thing to do from a legitimacy perspective, like, for instance, creating a reference list, right? Because you are expected to read the papers and select ones you want to include. So what I'm trying to say here is that just like Google Scholar in my generation, in your generation, you have a challenge, which is to understand the strengths and weaknesses of this technology and the normative framework around using it. And the challenge, of course, that technology keeps changing and the norms are very far from being defined. They are being defined now. But I also think that there is an opportunity, especially for us in the doctoral community, because PhD students like you are a learner, but you're also a contributor to knowledge. So what you do now is shaping what the next generation, how they're going to use generative AI, right? So it's going to define norms, it's going to define best practice about the use of generative AI in research that will make sense for decades to come. So that when you are sitting at this table 25 years from now, you can say, in my days, not everybody used generative AI. So yes, I agree. The key is that you are responsible for the outcome. You also have to remain in charge of the process. So you still need to decide what to read and what not to read. And you also need to consider to what extent generative AI use is aligned with your own personal values. So things around data protection, slave labor, environmental impact, and things like that. That's me.
Am I up next? I think I've got some slides just to keep myself a little bit on focus, so I'll come and grab them if that's all right. I'm sort of leaning into my people here. I am the thematic chair of digital social sciences, and I make my money from doing digital research, talking about digital issues and all of these things. But for the vast majority of what I read and think about in AI, I'm really quite critical of it for a range of reasons. Often this gets called being a Luddite, and I kind of resent that term a little bit. If you head an hour up the road from here, you will see a bunch of plaques, depends how fast you drive, probably an hour and a half, a bunch of plaques dedicated to the Luddites, and Ned Ludd in particular, who now we use the word Luddite to sort of talk about someone who's afraid of technology or has fear of technology or fear of change. Ned Ludd was beaten for not using technology in the workplace, and was a working class hero, quite frankly, who resisted the presence of technology in factories and sparked a political movement that tried to resist the ways in which technology was being used to take working class jobs. I often feel like we are at a crux here where certain scholars are talking quite a lot and have been talking quite a lot about the dangers of technology. I would point you to, I talked about this for 2 hours in my session, so go and read all the people that I cite. and talk about, but I would point you to the masses of research by Black, female, disabled and queer scholars who have been talking endlessly about the harms of technology in these regards. People like Joy Bulawami, who talks about how AI is coded on what she called pale male data that represents a very specific view of the world. People like Timnit Gebru, who was fired from Google for raising concerns about the racism of their AI systems, and talked about AI as like a stochastic parrot, is the term she used. By that she means it doesn't understand what it's saying, it parrots, right? We don't say that a parrot understands or is having a conversation with you. It can say something, but it doesn't understand it. And that was very much the point that she was trying to get at. Safia Noble's work that talks about algorithms of oppression and how Google sexualizes Black women and Asian women. Kevin Guyan's book, Queer Data, brilliant book that I recommend to so many people, that talks about what data is present on queerness and how that data tells a sort of sanitized version of what queerness is and what is left out of that story, either out of fear of discussion or out of sensibilities around what sexuality should be. Ruha Benjamin's work about New Jim Code. There's been so much research that talks about the harms and dangers of these technologies that I think we need to take seriously. I'm reminded, like, your talks throughout the last couple of days have been really insightful on this. I'm reminded of Charmaine's presentation about AI and hiring processes. We're going to continue to see these discussions, and I'm so proud of like some of the work that is coming out of this. The thing that I would point you all towards is the ways in which all data are inherently political. Every single bit of data, every single bit of research, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, is a political act. And AI, as Fragiskos says, is built in with specific biases that represent specific views of the world. So, for example, here's a quick screenshot of how AI responded early days to questions about Israel and Palestine that's now been cleaned up a little bit, and a picture from Wired.com when they asked it to produce a picture of a trans male. It wouldn't do that. It would only understand transness through a lens of male to female transition. Data is inherently political. Research is an inherently political act. I know it's a bit like cliche to quote Desmond Tutu, but I'm going to do it anyway. Desmond Tutu says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. I kind of feel this way quite heavily about technology. There's a term by Hannah Arendt that is, she talks about like the banality of evil, and says that evil isn't like a twirling moustache pantomime villain or literally Hitler, but it's in the sort of everyday acts and acceptance of the status quo around us. And we're living in increasingly politicized times, and starting to think about how we accept or don't accept the status quo is really important. One of the things I would point you towards is this paper by Jonas Well and others that talks about how when they try to remove toxicity from AI, the exact quote is, I'll put my glasses on, it comes at the cost of reduced coverage for text about and dialects of marginalized groups. AI doesn't know how to talk about marginalized people if it's not through a lens of toxicity. That's a real problem for us as researchers and for us as social scientists to think about how we tell different narratives. I also think about like the increasing presence of tech designers and people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk in the presence of sort of political realms and political spaces. Jessica's research about sleep apps comes in here, and how sleep apps are sold on a certain premise of fixing all these sleep problems, fixing the world of sleep. We can and should be critical of the ways in which technology is sold as fixing problems. And many of the people who design it are telling us it's fixing an issue. Some of those issues they create, some of those issues they exacerbate. And again, a lot of the Black and queer and female scholars are pointing to this sort of tension between designers and users. The other thing that I wanted to point out before I get off my little high horse is what we can do about it. I was also drawn towards Marina's work about science fiction and the ways in which science fiction tells different futures. Afrofuturism, for me, is a really useful avenue to talk about difference and futures that acknowledge histories and pasts, but also imagine different futures. There's a ton of research around futuring. Esther Priya Hedashini at UEA has written a brilliant book around it. who else? Jen Ross in Edinburgh has written really cool stuff around futures. Have a think about what futures are and what futures we head towards, and our role in creating different futures. The thing I would leave you with is that research is praxis, right? It's not just something that we do inherently, but it is a positionality to reality and to the normative and to our realities around us. I am really proud of the work that I've seen over the last couple of days coming out of SENSS and the ways in which you are producing critical, thoughtful, insightful work. I would ask you to carry on that sort of critical reading of your understandings of technologies, your understandings of these AIs. There's a ton of good ways of using AI. I'm not going to say I'm entirely against it, but I want you to think through the sort of costs and repercussions of using it. And I was told by Sage to promote my book. So my book's coming soon, Research in Digital Society, where you can read this, but like in longer form. So yeah, that's everything. Thanks.
Hello. Just to give you context, I'm a professor of computing, but I do not research in AI. The work I have been doing in the context of AI is situated in I led a project on setting up the AI policy for goldsmiths where I'm from, and I link that to my work or my actual research in disability inclusion and how that connects and the justice issues around that and the ethical issues around that. So I'm going to present 3 examples just to walk you through thinking about how we use AI on a day-to-day basis. So when you are, this is completely random slide I created. This is not what I'm presenting. But whenever you create PowerPoint slides, you'll find that it'll start suggesting in the designer mode, how can you improve it? How can you add design to it? And we've been using AI there. We have been using AI from the days of spell checker in Word, but it wasn't called that. So just wanted to take us along the journey to see where is the boundary and what changed. So next example, Grammarly. Now, DSA, if you have, for example, dyslexia, if you've been diagnosed with dyslexia, or any student really in most universities, it's provided as an app. It's a permitted tool for you to use Grammarly. This is just a screenshot from adding it to your browser. And they Grammarly introduced AI version of it, or generative AI supported version, somewhere along the way without any big announcement. And students who were using this AI tool, that was quite similar in some ways to spell checker in Word. It had a bit more. It'll help you paraphrase. It would help you with the tone of voice. Now suddenly started improving it with generative AI without any warning. Next one. So we have ChatGPT. And ChatGPT was introduced 2002, 2003. And before we knew it, lots of people were using it. There was a lot of fascination with we can use it to improve our writing, we can polish it up. Oh, I don't need to spend as much time on checking my spellings anymore, just feed it, it'll do it for you. Don't do it. Oh, do you need to analyze some data? Give it to ChatGPT, it will do it for you. Do you want a diagram? Give your data, it'll give you the diagram. Now, we are doing a lot of work, collaboration. In my department, lots of students resorted to ChatGPT for coding. Now, when is it okay? When isn't it okay? And how do we know the boundaries? So, 2-3 years down the line, our graduate jobs are at risk in computing because generative AI can do that. And students are wondering, okay, so we not only need to know how to use generative AI well, but we need to jump over that initial jobs we would have got and be better at what we can do as well. So I'm going to move on to just two questions to think about. What should the boundaries be and why? And I'm going to use Anna's example. Now, there was Google Scholar, and there was I think I'll use the digitization of text. There was a time if you had visual impairment, or if you took extra time or struggled to read because you were diagnosed with dyslexia or you had dyslexia, you just couldn't read what was on the paper. You just chose a different career that didn't demand you to read. But being able to digitize it and digitize it in an accessible way meant you could use a screen reader to listen to the same article. You could change the way it was laid out, the line spacing, the font, to remove that barrier for you. Does it mean it's okay? If it's removing barrier for someone, does it mean it's okay? If I do not struggle with that, is it still okay for me to use that? And what's the difference? So, what should the boundaries be? Why? And what is the environmental impact? And it's already been mentioned there by some of my colleagues here. The energy use each time you simply open ChatGPT, even before you send a command, what is the cost? And are we doing it intentionally, meaningfully? It's a tool that's available. And is it coming at the cost of losing skills? Probably. Even the calculator did that. And the computer did that. But are we aware and conscious of what new skills do we need to compensate, similar to the employment market? And are we aware of what we are losing because it's quite easy for us to resort to ChatGPT will polish up my writing for me, or Grammarly AI will fix it for me. And one sounds a bit more legitimate than the other one. And another, so as part of my work, when I put the policy together, something that came up repeatedly was the equity. Equity, I know as part of the ethics, you've been having several conversations around ethics about the data itself. Who does the data in these large language models represent? But flip it the other way around. Who has got access to all of these devices? Where are the equity issues there? Who can afford it? Who can afford the safer version, the ethical version, and who can't do it? So if you say yes in your classroom, if you're allowed to use any Gen AI of your choice, would you use the free version or the paid-for version? And what would that mean for the quality and the ethics and the data and what you put in and all of that? So I'm just going to leave those questions with you. Thank you.
Our final presenter is joining us via Zoom.
Can you hear me still?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. So I've thought, being the last speaker, let's start with, fun ways that we use AI. But having heard all the other speakers, now I'm worried I shouldn't have used generative AI to create this silly picture due to the environmental concerns. But I've thought, I'm sure just to have fun, most of us are using AI on a daily basis to generate pictures, as all the other colleagues mentioned, for various other reasons. So we already discussed the significant issues with regards to using AI. So I'm not going into the details because all the previous speakers covered the main issues we, struggle with is the authorship as well. We these days, obviously, as lecturers, professors, we're all dealing with so much AI generated work. Colleagues mentioned issues with bias, transparency, and I think, like colleagues already mentioned, data ethics is big problem for all of us researchers, because at the moment we don't know how the data is collected. Did somebody consent to their data being used? Is the data reliable? We're grappling with all these issues. There's the issue of privacy, and also, I think quite a few speakers already mentioned, there's the constant worry what AI does to us. Are we, excuse the language, becoming dumb and dumber? And I'm sure you've all read the recent MIT studies where they scan the users, the brains of the users of ChatGPT, and you've seen what it does to brains. So I think the critical questions for all of us, all of the researchers to think about is, how are we using this in our work? And I'm sure one way or another, as the previous speakers mentioned, we're all using it. But I think it's always worth thinking about bias, inaccuracies being introduced. The other speakers already touched upon these issues. The question is, are we really aware? We think we are aware of the biases, but are we? Is it clearly acknowledged in the research outputs? Because, journals at the moment, and I've read this statistics, I can't remember exactly, but they say now, especially in science-specific areas, 20% of the publications they receive are AI generated. Are we really finding this out? And how inclusive is the underlying data? The other speakers mentioned, we know AI is, biased, racist, minorities stand no chance because they're not equally represented. So having said all these things, I found the UK Research Integrity Office recently published guidelines very helpful. And I think as researchers, this is, tailored for researchers, but as social researchers, I think before we even start using AI, we need to ask these three questions. And I think the other presenters already talked about this. What are the tangible benefits? Why are we using AI? Will it save me time? Will it improve the process? Will it help me communicate my ideas better? And given the, disadvantages, is it even worth it? Second thing is the impact. Is it even appropriate, ethical, and necessary tool to use AI tools? Might it be ethical? Might it cause legal issues? Do we need to disclose the use of it? And finally, is it the only way to achieve the desired outcome? Can you actually have the same output via different means? And I think these are critical questions. Before even we get started, we need to ask ourselves these questions. One thing I've really thought was very interesting in my field, a human rights scholar said, AI is nowadays shown as the magic cure for everything. And she said she was having a conversation with care homes. And, they said they wanted to create these robo-dogs to keep company to pensioners and people in care home. And she questioned this. She said, why don't you have actual dogs? And the answer she get was, dogs poop. And she said, why don't you use maybe those AI to scoop up the poop instead of creating this, creepy robo-dogs that keep company and have a camera integrated to them? And I think this is something as researchers, as individuals, we need to really reflect on. Do we need AI for everything? And I've reflected a bit more on the role of social sciences. I think maybe I might have misread the panel questions, but I was thinking, as social scientists, what can we do towards pushing back and challenging AI as well. And I think the other presenters already presented very succinctly. What kind of society are we really trying to build with AI? And social sciences in that sense is really helpful, because as social scientists, we can actually study the real world impacts of AI. We can actually help the world to see the inequalities, systemic risks that AI presents to all of us. And I think as social researchers, we can push and we can try to change the agenda for having more inclusive, participatory design, because I think the other speakers mentioned as well, we all know these technologies are coming from global north. So technically, a small minority of the population is pushing their agenda towards minorities, marginalized groups. So I think as social researchers, we have a responsibility as well to push back and change the agenda as well. So I think here I put some of my thoughts, these are the things I think as social scientists we can do. We can contribute to, the expertise on improving data quality, because we're always, complaining about these things. What can we do to make sure AI has access to better data? What can we do in terms of analyzing historical comparative insights to show the world how AI can be biased, how algorithms can be biased, and how they can actually marginalize communities and exacerbate already existing inequalities in society? And as a lawyer, I think it is our role to show, how can we inform regulation and public policy? How can we work with a range of stakeholders to address these challenges? And how can we make sure all these marginalized voices are actually heard? So I have some recommendations for action. So obviously, it's crucial for all of us, PhD researchers, to build our AI literacy, because I don't know about your colleagues, but I have some colleagues who wouldn't even touch the word AI. It gives them the icks. But I mean, we need to all aware of the uses of AI. We need to build our literacy around these things, because whether we like AI or not, it's here to stay with us. So what I've thought was very interesting is already certain disciplines are working together towards, building guidance, etc. Especially in my field, there's a lot of interest. Obviously, there's a commercial interest as well, to look at the use of AI in legal firms and legal practices. And I completely echo what Jennifer has said. There's a big concern in the legal community that, most of the trainee jobs, initial entry-level jobs are going to vanish with the use of generative AI. So the question I think we need to be all asking ourselves is, how can we get better? Because in order to use AI, we need to be able to critique AI as well. So we need to work on this. And I think social sciences in itself, it's great that we work together as social scientists, but we need to obviously collaborate with other disciplines. We can't live in our silos. We need to work with, competing community. We need to work with companies that actually produce these technologies. And I think we should all work towards, perhaps developing more discipline-specific guidelines. And finally, I think we can all work towards, pushing for more transparency and accountability in AI systems. So my final questions, and I think this is a question I put it to all of us. How can our research discipline can contribute to shaping the future of AI? As researchers, what can we do? As teachers, lecturers, how can we teach our students how to use AI responsibly, not for the sake of using it? And how can we explain to them, the actual use cases? And finally, I wanted to ask all of you, because there's all this talk about making AI more neutral, less biased. And I think I am a pessimist on that front. We are individuals. AI is created by humans. Can AI ever be neutral? Can it ever be not racist or not sexist? And I leave it here. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Asem.